A feature of Unity that's been gaining a lot of popularity lately is Scriptable Objects. Scriptable Objects have been featured in a few good Unite talks, which I'll link in the description below. They're really worth watching. And I've noticed a rise in videos from Unity YouTubers on the subject of Scriptable Objects. And there's good reason behind this, because Scriptable Objects are really powerful. In the recent videos and tutorials I've been watching, I've noticed some emerging trends which could lead to certain problems. A lot of the tutorials I've seen are showing you that you can save your game data in Scriptable Objects. And this could lead to problems down the line. While you're in development, then you can edit the Scriptable Objects as much as you want, or enter play mode and continue to edit those Scriptable Objects, and everything will be persisted. Whereas when you create a build of your game, those Scriptable Objects then become static, which means you'll no longer be able to use them as a persistence tool. So as of right now, I'm very worried there's going to be a lot of developers who go through the whole process of creating all their save data with Scriptable Objects, only to get to the end to find out that they're going to have to figure out some way of managing that. So in this tutorial, we're going to look at how you can persist your Scriptable Objects without having to make a whole lot of changes to them. Okay, so over here I have a new project, and let's just make something quickly to get up and running. Going to create a scripts folder and a scenes folder. In the scripts folder, let's create a new script, C# script, and I'm going to call it Scriptable int. Okay, we're going to keep this class fairly simple. It is going to inherit from Scriptable object, and it will have a public integer of value. Okay, so it's a very simple Scriptable object. I'm also just going to add create asset menu up here, so that we'll be able to create the object from the asset menu. Save the script. Okay, now let's just create a new folder called variables. Now in here, let's come up to create again and go to Scriptable int, and we'll just call it counter. And let's just set the beginning value to 5. Okay, now let's create another script, and we'll call it text updater. Okay, in addition to using the Unity engine, we're also going to be using unityengine.ui. At the top of the class, let's add a public Scriptable int, and we'll call it myInt. And we're also adding a public text called myText. So this will hold my Scriptable integer, and this will hold the text item that I'm going to be updating on the screen with the text from the integer. Okay, so we're just going to leave the start function there for now. We'll start a function, public, it will return void, it's going to be called add, and it will take an integer called amount. So there we go, basic stuff. We're just taking the integer, adding on the amount to that integer, and setting it. Let's also create another function. This one's just going to be called refresh, and it will return void. Okay, we're setting the text property of myText to myInteger value to string. Okay, so we want to call that whenever someone adds something to the value, and also when the application begins. Okay, so that's all we need in our text updater class. So save that, come back into Unity. In the hierarchy, right click, UI, text. So that's added a canvas for us and a text item. And let's just set the canvas scaler to scale with screen size. Okay, now let's just make the text a lot bigger and center it in the middle of the screen. Take up the font size. Change everything to center. Change its color to white. Okay, that should look pretty good. Let's just set the text to nothing for now. Now let's also add a button to our canvas. I'm just going to move that down to the bottom of the screen. Align it to the bottom. Open out the button and change its text to add 1. Okay, now to our button. Let's just drag that text updater onto the inspector, and we'll add the counter object to my int, and we'll drag that text that we added earlier onto my text. Now the button will also have this onClick event, so if I click that, drag on the object, come down to text updater and change that to add int, and we're adding 1, so we'll set this to 1. Okay, don't forget to save your scene. I've just called mine scene. Let's play the application. Okay, you can see 5 came up here, which is the number we set in our counter. If I hit add 1, it'll incrementally increase that number. If I stop the application, which is let's say equivalent to exiting the application, and then open it again, that number is still 8. So the state of our scriptable object has stayed the same even though I exited the application. Change it to 14, run it again, once again it's still that same number. Okay, so what about when you actually build the application? So if we come to our build settings, drag in the scene, and click build. Let's choose a location for this. I'm just going to create a new folder called builds. And I'm just going to call it object testing. Okay, and here's my built application. If I run that one and tell it to open it windowed, okay, you can see that it's kept the same number that was in there at build time. So I can now add to that number again. However, when I close the application and then reload it, it's reverted back to 14. So as previously mentioned, now that the application has been built, this object is now static. So anyone who's using scriptable objects for saving data will run into some problems here. There's a few different ways that we can make this persistent. Let's have a look at one of them. So in our scripts folder, let's come up to create C# script. And I'm going to call it Persistable SO for Scriptable Object. Okay, let's start by removing the start and update functions, so we won't be using them. And in our using, we're going to add using system.runtime.serialization.formatters.binary. So this is what we're going to be using to save the state of our scriptable objects to file. And then because we're adding them to file, we also need to bring in system.io. Okay, we're only going to be using 2 functions in here, so we're going to add onEnable and onDisable. So whenever this object is enabled, it will restore the state of our scriptable objects, and whenever it's disabled, it will save the state of the scriptable objects to file. Okay, so at the top here, I'm adding a list of scriptable objects. I'm just going to call it objects to persist. So not all of our scriptable objects will need to be persisted, only the ones we're using for save data, or even options data. And I'm also going to give a name to this object. That's just so that we can keep it unique in case we're adding multiple persistable objects. And that'll make more sense as we go through this process. So let's start on saving data. So on disable, I've just copied in a for loop here, so for all of the objects within our objects to persist, so this list up here. We're going to create a binary formatter and a file stream. So the binary formatter is what will encode it, and the file is the file that we're going to store it in. So the file stream called file is equal to file.create application.persistentDataPath. So if you haven't used application.persistentDataPath before, what they'll do is for whatever platform you're on, it'll give you the path to where you can store some data. So if you're on Windows, Mac or mobile platforms, this will give you a safe storage location. And we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail soon. So to this persistent data path, we're adding a string with format. It's going to be 2 items and .pso for persistable scriptable object. The first part of it is going to be the unique name that we're giving to this collection. The second part is going to be the location of the object in the array. Okay, so now that we've created the file, we need to turn our scriptable object from a scriptable object into a plain string of text. The easiest way to do that and the most reliable way is using JSON. So a variable called JSON, using the JSON utility to JSON, and we're just sending the object at the current index. So that'll be the scriptable object at this index in the array. Then we're just going to use our binary formatter to serialize our JSON into the file and then close the file. Okay, so if I come back to Unity now and create a new game object that I'm just going to call save data. Let's drag the persistable SO onto that. Give it the name main. Now in the objects to persist, let's give it 3 objects. And what I'll do is just create a few more variables. Now you can use any scriptable object here, but I'm going to just keep using my scriptable int because I'm sure we're running short on time. Okay, so now we have 3 different objects. I'm going to add some numbers to them. Come to my save data, and let's just drag all of them on. Okay, so on disable, all of these items will be saved to a file. So if I run the application and close the application, all of those would have now been saved to a file. Now how can you find where this file is? We have a look under the build settings and then player settings. This is for Windows, by the way. For Mac it's slightly different. So I'm going to see here I got my company name and the product name. If I come into C drive, users, my name, app data, local low, I should have this company name up here, which is default company. And then the name of the project, which is saving data scriptable object. For yours will be whatever is in your product name. Okay, so now we can see those 3 items that we made. So we can see we made the name of it based on the name of the object, plus the index in the array. If I open one of them in Notepad, there's going to be some odd characters because we've serialized it, but you also see our JSON in here as plain text. For the property of value, we have it set to 14 in this case. Okay, so that's saving data. Now how do we bring it back in? Come back to the persistable SO, and this time to the onEnable. Okay, so once again we're starting with a for loop that will go through each of those objects that we have up here. And then the first thing we're doing is checking the file path, so if file exists at the persistent data path and then that same string that we used earlier over here. So if a file exists at that path, we're once again creating a binary formatter and a file stream, this time with file open, whereas last time we were using file create. And once again that same path, and then using file mode open. Okay, so we've opened the file. Now let's use the JSON utility again with from JSON overwrite. The override is important. If you use just from JSON, it's not going to work. Okay, and we're deserializing the file as a string and then overriding it to the object at the index in this list. So we're taking the file, we're deserializing it as JSON, and then we're using JSON to create the object and override it. Then when all that's done, we can close the file, save the script. Let's come back over and test if that works. Okay, so if I add one now, close the application, reopen, it's still working as before, except now the file is getting saved and loaded each time as well. So now if I build the application again, okay, so that previous number was 17, let's add to it to say 26, close the application, reopen the application, and there we go, it's still 26. So you can potentially keep adding to this persistable scriptable objects array and all the objects will be saved and then reloaded every time the application is open and closed. You may want to handle it differently in your game, but this should be a pretty good boilerplate set of code for you to get started with. Being able to export scriptable objects as JSON can be really useful, especially in cases where you want to save your data in the cloud. It's a very easy way to pack all the data into a couple of strings and then send it off and then retrieve it again later. Alright, so I hope you found this video useful. If you're curious about editor scripting and cleaning this up to make it look really useful, I have a course on editor scripting at the moment on Udemy. I've got links to that in the description below. I'd really love for you to check it out. So thank you for your time. I hope you found this useful. I hadn't found any other sites that were really covering this sort of functionality. I pretty much threw this example together because I couldn't find any boilerplate code on the net already for it. So good luck and keep using scriptable objects, they're great.